Welcome to Curious and Quirky, the podcast that unpacks innovation, pokes at conventional wisdom, and occasionally reminds us that we've always done it this way is not a good strategy. This isn't your grandpa's podcast, though if he were running a project today in today's world, he'd probably say, let's try it this way, and then 5 minutes later say, okay, new plan. Now, each month we bring together the brilliant, bold thinkers from the Caltech Executive Education to explore what leaders mostly get right and what teams somewhat try to make it happen. It's April, where the month has expectations, and sometimes those expectations that we built in January begin to meet reality. And then when we start realizing that reality usually wins. So we're going to lean into that a bit today. We'll explore what works, question what doesn't, and maybe even embrace a few ideas that feel just a little bit uncomfortable. So grab your coffee or your April showers productivity punch or whatever keeps your thinking flexible, and let's get curious and maybe just a little bit quirky. All right, so this month we're going to start off with Bryan Mattimore. As we roll into April, the month where expectations begin to get tested and surprises tend to show up right on schedule, it feels like the perfect time to bring in someone who knows how to think a little bit differently. Sometimes all you need to start a trend is something fresh, something new, even if it's just a new catchphrase. So we thought it's the perfect time to talk about simply words. Now, specifically the kind of words that make you stop and think, wait, is that a real thing now? I've heard plenty of words in my life, and sometimes I definitely come to mind that I didn't know that was a real thing. Bryan Mattimore is the co-founder of the Growth Engine Company and the author of 21 Days to a Big Idea. And he's known for helping teams turn the what if questions into why not. And sometimes it spawns and spurns out entire new ways of thinking. Because here's the thing, innovation doesn't always start with simply a product. Sometimes it actually just starts with a simple phrase. Now, this month, Bryan's going to dive into how newly coined terms can reflect coincidentally create and how it can coincidentally create new trends. Set jetting, rage bait, bed rotting, etc. And somewhere along the way, someone did say these out loud, and now they're part of the world that we see. And that's kind of the point. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Bryan Mattimore.
Oh gosh, thank you, Tim. What a great introduction. I love that. We're recording this, right? Yeah, we are. Uh, so, um, I want to just set this up a little bit. I was in the eighth grade. Which was a while ago, and I was reading a book, and my eighth grade social study teachers came to me and said, "Geez, is that an advanced book for you, or how do you like that book?" And I said, "This is the best book I have ever read in my entire life." And he said, "Well, is it because there's sex scenes in there?" I said, No, that's not the reason. Then there are some. Um, the book was 1984 by George Orwell. And I was so enamored and so entranced. And so I thought it was so provocative that he was looking at the use of language as a vehicle for, quote, controlling thought, right? And so, there was newspeak in there, and you could be an unperson, which would mean you would be erased from history, or, double think, or plus good, ungood, double plus good, good think. One of my favorite was face crime, right? A facial expression that suggests dissent on improper thought. And so the notion was they had a whole department in the Big Brother Society reducing language in order to have greater control of people. And so we're on the opposite side of that spectrum now, right? Because with all the certainly social media, all the new terms that have come out, to deal with that, AI, certainly there are a whole bunch of terms coming out, and more will be coming. If I hear AI agentic one more time, I'm gonna shoot myself. No, I'm not kidding. Uh, but the research I did says we create about 4,000 new words each year. And so that's really fun. Tim had mentioned one. I'll just, if you haven't heard of the term set jetting, I had not heard about it until a few weeks ago. What would that be? Obviously, it's a play on jet setting. But what it is, I think it's a really clever, creation of a term. It's traveling to real world locations on a vacation where movies and TV shows have been shot, right? So you go to the set and you're set jetting there. It made me think of my wife and I took a vacation to Key West, and the series Bloodline had been shot there. And so we're eating in all the hotels, and we're seeing, and it was really kind of fun to recognize all these places we had seen on TV. Okay, so that's, it's provocative, but let's sort of bottom line this. We're, as Tim said, we're sort of in the month of possibly of implementation here, right? And I'll just give a little bit of history. If you want to create a new business theory or model, it's a really good idea to have a term that captures it. And I one of the more not overly recent examples, but blue ocean strategy. I don't think that would have become the theory of that would have become nearly as successful had it not been such a great term. Being in the blue ocean versus fighting it out in a red ocean where there's blood, right? Before that, this was in the 90s, we had the learning organization. And just by calling it, Peter Senge in his fifth discipline, just by calling it the learning organization, all of a sudden it gave some teams permission to research and to create an organization that would be oriented toward learning, right? And even before that, and this shows my age a little bit, but I did some work with a company and a guy named Gifford Pinchot. And Gifford, he's actually still alive. He's like 95. He created the term intrapreneuring, right? And he built his whole business around the notion that you have intrapreneurs or entrepreneurs within your organization. And just again, coining that term, which was a brilliant and clever coinage, led to the idea and got many corporations to look for their internal entrepreneurs. So that's kind of fun, right? And now let's talk about real world applications of this. In our ideation sessions, a couple of things. We often will name something before we've kind of figured it out. So somebody will say something. I say, well, what'd you call that? And I do that because it crystallizes the idea, it gives focus to the idea, and it gives energy to the idea. So sometimes if you're, kind of lost in the woods here, you could ask your coworkers, well, what would you name that thing? And that might crystallize it down for you. That's one thing. The other thing is there is a technique called semantic intuition. It's one of my favorite new product development techniques. It was invented by Spitale in Germany. And the notion is exactly what we're talking about, that you name an idea before you know what it is, right? And so we've used this a lot in our ideation sessions when, the most famous example I have, and I've told this before, but I'll mention it again, when we were trying to, create a new Chips Ahoy cookie for Mondelez. And the way you do this is you combine different columns of words. So, desserts with product forms, with ingredients, and that led to the brownie Chips Ahoy, the idea of putting a layer of brownie inside a chocolate chip cookie. And of course, now they've expanded that. The food technologists have figured out how to manufacture it. And so now if you go to a store, you'll see a layer of Hershey's chocolate inside your Chips Ahoy cookie. So that's one very practical use of the idea of naming it at the start. Now, I want to talk, I want to give a nod to Caltech and Curious and Quirky here. And so I said, well, if I'm really this innovation guy, let me try to create a new model, a new business theory, right, based on coining a new term. And so I took inspiration from what? Curious and Quirky, right? And so I've created what's called the curiocentric organization, right? Now, what is that? What is a curiocentric organization? Well, obviously, it's interested in curiosity. But, to make these things work, if you really want to have a workable business model, you have to, systematize it. You have to come up with a system around it, right? You can't just say, yeah, be more curious, have fun, go be more curious. No, you got to kind of figure it out. So I've come up with, if you will, 5 principles or actions around creating a curiocentric organization. The first thing is to embed curiosity in meetings, right? So at every meeting, there should be at least 2 or more questions that are being asked at every meeting. And those questions could be like, what are we not seeing? What assumptions are we making? What could change our thinking? What would surprise our customer? So if this is brought into every meeting, oh my gosh, you begin to really create both ideas that come out of that, insights, research opportunities, but also, frankly, permission to be curious, right? Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, in this system, you have to build a way to capture it, So you should have ways of capturing all these curious thoughts and questions. And, these could be, you could have one category of customer frustrations, odd behaviors, weird thoughts. Again, you're giving permission to everybody, but capturing things is important. Why? That'll go to step four. Let me go to step three before I do that. To create a curiocentric organization, right? It'd be good to train leaders in question-led management. We often look to leaders for answers. Well, let's start looking, and not that we're not doing this now, but let's look even more to leaders for questions, right? And so instead of Mr. Leader, what should we do here? It's like the leader should be asking, what are we missing? What else might be true? What would a competitor do differently, etc. Again, this creates this idea of a curiocentric organization by having this in the training, right? Okay. And so now we're on to number four. Number four is interesting. We've done a lot of this work, which is about cross-departmental fertilization. And so the notion is that different departments, you can have them in your sessions and programs and initiatives because they will be curious about things that you've accepted just out of hand because you've been doing that way for many, many years. So the idea of cross-functional teaming and ideation is a really important thing. And by the way, this is not only internal. You want to do it also with suppliers and customers and all the rest. So that's number four in this five-part process model for creating a curiocentric organization. And the final one is obviously you have to link this to action. And so maybe your innovation agent team internally, or your chief innovation officer, or your R&D department, or whatever, they should be a repository of all these curious questions, right? This curious questioning, because all of those can be used in ideation sessions. They can imply research challenges and opportunities. You should have questions about trends in there, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's what I wanted to share with you guys today. Think curiocentric organization. I guess the vision of this thing, this would be the tagline I might have for this. The future rarely belongs to the organization with all the answers. It belongs to the organization still being curious and asking better questions. All right. Curious and quirky. We're on to the next quirkiness here with Ginny. Ginny is our OD guru, and Ginny, I'll just leave it at that. I think guru is enough, so
That's
I'll let you
quite
go.
enough. That's fine.
Yeah.
So, as part of the Faculty for the Future Skills Academy, we talk about certainly skills of the future. There are skills that are important to get right today, currently, and in the future. And the skills for leaders, one of the most important skills for leaders is decision making. So as I think about this, I've been working with executive teams for well over 30 years, and I work with them to become, more functional. How can we be more functional team? Or rather, how can we be less dysfunctional? And as I work with them, a common challenge comes up again and again, and they question this. These executives are challenged with how decisions get made. And what becomes curious is, as leaders, this is their primary responsibility, making good decisions. So, in kind of researching this, there's a report in the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists, and it says despite billions spent on training leaders, 85% of mid to senior level professionals have never received training in decision making. And 45% still do not have a structured way to make decisions. And then add to this the vast amount of information available now, particularly with AI, this complicates this even further. So as I thought about this, while the lack of formal training in decision making is interesting, I have to ask myself, is that the concern being raised? Or is it less about how to make a good decision, or more about, and I'll quote Hamilton, I want to be in the room where it happens. what those executives are actually asking isn't just how do we decide, it's also what game are we playing and how do I win or contribute to it? So it's not a question of capability. These are experienced, intelligent executives, yet even the strongest teams experience this kind of friction, delay, and frustration, particularly when the decision process is ambiguous. The dysfunction caused when it's not clear who decides, how decisions get made, and when. And that is the cause of this ambiguity. And as with most dysfunctional teams, and most teams are to some extent, the road to being functional is lined with clarity, clarity around roles and process. So, what does this decision ambiguity look like? Well, it's often the lack of the identity of the actual decision maker. Who has the say in this decision? And then what's the role of input versus authority? So sometimes people are made to feel that, well, I gave my input, I gave my opinion on the decision. Why wasn't that the actual decision? So that kind of creates this frustration where informal influence overrides formal. So it's those side conversations that are impactful versus what everyone thinks is the official conversation in the meeting room. These kind of side conversations have already happened, and maybe decisions have gotten made even before the formal decision-making meeting. So creates a lot of frustration and lack of trust, actually. So why does this matter? What is this lack of clarity around decision? Why does that matter? Well, there's certainly slower decisions and perhaps missed opportunities, not taking in all the input from all the people who do have that knowledge and expertise. Another source of frustration is revisiting a decision that everyone felt was already made. So this comes up again in a meeting and everyone's kind of shaking their heads, saying, well, didn't we decide on that like a month ago? And as I said, this erodes trust. And then people kind of sort of give up. They're in these meetings and they say, why does it matter? This decision has probably already been made before. And then that creates kind of a misalignment in the organization. So what do high performing teams do differently? Well, high functioning executive teams are defined by clarity and discipline. And they are explicit about who has decision rights, how is input gathered and weighed, what decision-making process is being used. Is it that, kind of decide and announce the leader's going to make the decision, kind of take the input in from everyone and have the final say? Is it more of a consultative conversation? Is it consensus where you want to get the team to kind of get on board with the decision? And as this happens, there's got to be a look forward because it's one thing about a decision being made, but then it's got to be implemented. And if the right people haven't been involved in the process and they are important in the implementation of the decision, that will not go well. So what improving the decisions that are made, the team must align on how. So again, naming the decision model, agreeing on the decision archetypes, and announcing that and reinforcing the clarity about what's going on. So really what's important is the decision making has to be explicit. It has to be clear because when it's implicit and unknown, it's not going to be trusted. And the implementation of that decision will be impaired. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our supply chain guru, Alan Dunn.
Well, thank you, Jenny. It seems like a lot of old thinking has new roots, new capabilities. Some things never change. Logic certainly never changes, especially when it comes to leadership, credibility, and trust. And that kind of segues into what I want to talk about. I want to really today talk about a 110-year-old new decision. I'm going to talk about Terafab. I've actually spent the last week and a half in a series of analysts meetings of significant financial analysts who are looking at the supply chain industry and looking at where it goes. And so I want to focus on Terafab, which is Elon Musk's new semiconductor operation. So Terafab is really about supply chain proximity and the return of vertical integration. This is a societal level change that's likely to happen, certainly an industrial change that will happen. And back in March, so not long ago, Elon announced Terafab, which is a vertically integrated semiconductor manufacturing initiative that spans Tesla, SpaceX, and xAI, his AI venture. It's going to be centered initially in Austin, Texas. Musk described it to the analysts as the most epic chip building exercise in history, and I don't think he's wrong. This has a long-term goal of producing up to 1 terawatt of AI computational capabilities annually. At first glance, Terafab looks a little bit like a bold bet on scale, but strategically, it seems to represent something more important. It actually represents a return to supply chain proximity and vertical integration of kind of a philosophy that echoes Henry Ford's 110-year-old manufacturing model of the 1930s. Well, actually 1900 to 1930s, and actually stands in sharp contrast to today's globally fragmented semiconductor supply chain. So let's talk a little bit about what Terafab is and why it's important to all of us and why proximity in today's world matters. Terafab is planned as a fully vertically integrated semiconductor facility, combining chip design, fabrication, memory production, advanced packaging, and testing, all under one multi-story roof. Musk emphasized that the goal is not to become a merchant foundry, but to secure internal chip supply for Tesla vehicles and robots, SpaceX systems, including his humanoids, and xAI infrastructure. In other words, he's building this to support his own businesses. This is very Henry Fordish, I should say. So, by the way, a little bit of a modern twist on that is that there's a little bit of shades, perhaps, of the company U.S. Robotics that dominated global humanoid production, distribution, and service in the 2004 hit movie I, Robot. A central design principle of Terafab is physical proximity. This is probably the single most important design principle that he's put together. He's argued that today's semiconductor process, where wafers, masks, and designs move between continents for fabrication, packaging, and testing, creates just unacceptable delays when product life cycles are measured oftentimes in months rather than in years. We'll also talk in a second about the ability to innovate quicker and to get innovative ideas and products into service into the marketplace even faster when you're fully vertically integrated. Terafab is intended to enable rapid iteration. Design a chip, fabricate it, test it, revise the mask, and repeat without shipping wafers across the globe. This tight feedback loop doesn't currently exist in any advanced semiconductor facility at scale. It really has the potential, at least this is my opinion, to accelerate technology because it accelerates the provisioning of the engine of technology, which of course is semiconductors. Modern semiconductor manufacturing, turns out, is a key feature of global specialization. And by the way, I've lived this in a number of my semiconductor clients over the years. Design can happen in California, fabrication in Taiwan or South Korea, advanced packaging in Southeast Asia, and final system integration elsewhere, including testing elsewhere, distribution elsewhere. I've actually tracked a number of semiconductors from the actual creation of the silicon wafer all the way through to the distribution and found that the biggest winner in all of this tends to be the air freight companies because most of this does move by air. This model is extraordinarily efficient. This current model with specialization across the globe turns out is extraordinarily efficient, but for long-lived and stable products. But it tends to struggle. In fact, it struggles mightily when demand spikes unpredictably, as with AI accelerators, when product architectures change rapidly, that is, when engineering changes happen rapidly, and when capacity is constrained at the leading edge nodes. Multiple analysts that we talked with note that Terafab is fundamentally a response to these constraints. External foundries, such as TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and Samsung, are expanding, but at a pace that Musk considers insufficient for his company's projected needs. back to he's doing this to support his own needs. However, this could change the nature of industry if it actually works. Rather than waiting in allocation queues, TerraFab aims to collapse the supply chain geographically, turning what is now a multi-year, multi-vendor coordination problem into an internal engineering problem. Now, there's an interesting parallel with Henry Ford. I started off talking about Henry Ford, and this strategy actually resembles Henry Ford's vertical integration in the earliest 20th century. By the 1930s, Ford controlled iron mines, railroads, steel mills, glass plants, and final assembly factories. The River Rouge plant in Michigan is a complex that's famous for turning raw ore into finished cars within a single coordinated system. Ford's motivation was actually not based on ideology. It was based on speed, cost control, most specifically on quality assurance and reliability in an era where transportation and supplier coordination were slow and uncertain. Remember, that was the days before computers. If you had to go talk to the iron ore mine, you had to get on a ship, not an airplane, but you had to get on a ship and sail across the country. So a 30-minute conversation required 3.5 weeks to 3 months to conclude. And so Elon has suggested that TerraFab, and this is his words, represents a new ecosystem where chips are the new steel. When compute becomes the limiting factor for cars, robots, and space systems, outsourcing that constraint becomes strategically risky. Vertical integration itself is now no longer an obsolete idea. It's not just efficient, but it's actually necessary. This brings us to a broader point. The vertical integration becomes more valuable as product life cycles shrink. In AI, robotics, and autonomous systems that we're seeing expanding at an enormously fast rate, hardware and software now co-evolve rapidly. Chips are increasingly domain specific. That means that you have a chip for a phone, then you have a chip for a computer, you have a chip for the navigation system in your car, and you have a chip in your iron and a chip in your telephone or your refrigerator. And so they tend to be very domain specific, which means that we're trying to take this very complex product and put it into these slices of very thin market niches, which means speed becomes important. Iteration in the engineering and design process becomes more important than unit cost. Elon's actually stated on a number of occasions that it's really about enabling what he refers to as recursive self-improvement, or RSI. This is a known terminology that really describes an engineering loop. It's a process which a system can autonomously modify its own code, its own algorithms, or its own decision-making logic to enhance its performance. And in doing so, improves the very mechanisms it uses to improve itself. This creates a feedback loop that goes something like this: improve the improver, which then improves faster, which then improves its own improving ability again, and repeat. By contrast, the traditional semiconductor model has evolved around consumer electronics and enterprise computing, where architectures were actually stable for years. That assumption no longer holds true and will never come back again. So if you think about this on a societal basis, TerraFab may be an early example of a broader shift as societies move toward AI-defined products, robotics integrated into daily life, and infrastructure that blends hardware, software, and energy being the third leg of the stool. The distinction between supplier and manufacturer now begins to blur. The analyst that we talked to noted that TerraFab is a project that signals a future where leading technology firms will likely try to attempt to control the entire compute stack, not just the software layers. That's a huge, huge shift with enormous consequences. This does not mean that globalization disappears, by the way, but it does mean that strategic components migrate closer to the point of use. So let me wrap this up. Ford integrated vertically because shipping steel was just too slow. Musk is doing the same because shipping wafers is too slow. Interesting, if you look at it this way, the constraint has changed, but the logic has not. TerraFab is actually not about chips. It's about time. Time lost to shipping, time lost to coordination, time lost when product life cycles outrun product supply chains. Like Henry Ford's factories 100 years ago, TerraFab, I think, reflects a moment where technological ambition collides with logistical realities. When that happens, vertical integration stops being a historical curiosity and becomes once again an absolute competitive necessity. And that's all for supply chain for the day. Take it away, Tim.
All right, thanks, Alan. And so much to unpack. I wrote down lots of questions that I want to ask you after this. Um, to keep with the ideology of the theme, it seems for the month is all about ideas and coming up with new perspectives, etc. I want to share a story. Just a couple days ago, somewhere between a normal bedtime conversation and complete nonsense, my daughter and I stumbled onto something special. Um, we were just hanging out, getting ready for bed, and talking about our days. Nothing special, the traditional, normal conversation. And then, like it always does, the conversation drifted. 1 minute it's about what you did at school and about all the snacks. Yes, snacks are a very big deal in my house. And the next minute you're making up stories about dragons, robots, or why broccoli is a little suspicious. Then out of nowhere, she asks a very simple question. What would dinosaurs look like with hair? And that was it. And we were off and running. We were fully committed at that point to the artistic endeavor of exploring this newfound avenue of creativity. So, over the course of the next 5 minutes, there was the Brontosaurus with the long, flowing red hair. Then the T-Rex with that messy, rolled out of bed look. And then, of course, always have to have the Triceratops with bangs that, for that day just weren't cooperating. And then it continued to escalate. What about sharks? There was like a really big dinosaur shark, right? What was it called? It was the Megalodon. It must have had really, really big hair. And at that point, I would say we were gone. We were so far down the rabbit hole, we were basically having tea with the Mad Hatter. We're giggling and laughing off the rails. There was zero structure, just building out this completely ridiculous prehistoric world where apparently everything had a stylist. But here's what stuck with me from that night. It wasn't the ideas itself. It was the pace at which those ideas seemed to form. One idea turned onto the next, the snowball into the next, into the next, into the next. There was no pausing, no filtering, no one stepping in to say, yeah, but that just doesn't make any sense. Just continuous momentum. And I've mentioned this before in a previous podcast, is that somewhere along the way, we lose that. Not in a big obvious way, but gradually over the course of time. We start thinking a little longer before we speak. We start editing ideas before they're fully formed. And we start leaning toward what sounds right or toward solution space instead of what actually might go somewhere. Ginny talked a little bit about we are looked to as leaders to have the answers and the solutions as opposed to kind of thinking through the what could be. And I do see it all the time. There's tons of rooms full of smart people, capable people, people that actually care about each other. But inevitably, there's always some point in time when an idea shows up and it gets shut down immediately. Not because it's necessarily a bad idea, but because it's early. It's early in the ideation process, and it's early in that stage. It's too rough or it's too different from what we typically have done before. So it gets labeled. And we all know exactly what happens when an idea gets labeled too early. It usually disappears. So here's how we can shift our mentality. In my experience, most teams don't have an idea generation problem. Maybe they need to talk to Brian a bit more to figure out how to more effectively do it. But we, as individuals, as leaders, as engineers, as supporting functions, we all have ideas about how to make things better. What typically I see is it's a timing problem. They move to judgment way faster than they move towards exploration. And that to me is a leadership issue and a cultural issue. Because your job isn't to have the best idea in the room as a leader. It's to make sure that ideas can survive long enough to actually become something worthwhile. Even the weird ones. No, scratch that, especially the weird ones. If that still feels a little abstract, let's zoom out for a second. We just sent humans back to the moon, not physically to the moon, but in the orbit of the moon, the first time since 1972. I think it was December of 1972. The Artemis mission launched recently, and just a couple days ago, they all returned safely home. So let's take a second to think about what that actually takes. There's the spacecraft that has to travel hundreds of thousands of miles, 238,000 miles on average, for those out there counting. There's the launch system, one that is stronger than anything we've used in decades, a flight path that loops around the moon and brings people home safely. And all of it has to work the first time. There's no reset button, there's no go backs, and there's no mulligans. But none of that started clean. I can 100% guarantee you, because I am in the space industry myself, it didn't show up as a perfect plan. It started as a trade study. It started out arguments at a whiteboard, half-baked ideas about heat shields, re-entry angles, comm delays, crew safety, all these things. And at some point, someone said, "What if we tried this?" And I guarantee you that version probably wasn't very polished. And so it reminds me of the first proposals that were submitted when we first went to the moon. When Kennedy announced and stood in front of Rice University and said, "We're going back to the moon by the end of the decade." A lot of the proposals I saw doing some research, one had a vision of a 12-person moon colony for the very first time going to the moon. And it's this incredible idea and innovation that people had. Now, imagine if those ideas got shut down super early, specifically for the Artemis mission. It's too risky or it's too expensive or we've never done it that way or why does it even matter to go back? We've already been there. What's the result? You don't launch, you don't get to the moon, and you don't get Artemis. Big innovation doesn't always come from perfect ideas. It comes from giving imperfect ideas enough room to evolve. So the next time you're sitting in a meeting and something half-formed shows up, instead of jumping straight to, "Yeah, that's definitely not going to work," or "That's probably not going to work," reframe it in your mind and think, what could this idea turn into if we stayed with it just a little bit longer? Okay. At the end of the day, I keep coming back to that conversation and that night with my daughter. It's okay to let the dinosaur have hair for a minute, not forever, just long enough to see where it goes. Because whether it's a ridiculous conversation before bed or a mission that just went to the moon and back, they both start the same way, unfinished. All right, with that, we'll bring everyone back to the table. I got lots of questions. I'm sure everyone else has lots of questions. I want to start with Ginny. Ginny, I think one of the things you talked about is the idea of decision makers, and people don't always feel like they've been seen or heard. So I think just a comment first is, in my opinion, people just want to be seen and they want to feel heard, and no matter what decisions we're making over the course of time as leaders. And I think sometimes they are afraid that if people are making decisions that are very different than what they've thought about or didn't get a chance to, then they have concerns there. But I think my major question is one of the things that I've seen is when people are making decisions from a leadership perspective and they effectively have no skin in the game where they're not part of the implementation or
Yeah.
part of the actual execution,
Yeah.
that's where the big disconnects happen, where
Yeah.
you're asking me to do this, but
Yeah.
you don't recognize that this is almost impossible to do, and then you go off and do other things and make other decisions, but
Right.
it's very difficult to do. Any perspectives on that idea?
Yeah, I mean that there's so much to that. I mean, first of all, um, when those people aren't heard, there's this feeling that there's an inner circle that the leader does
Yeah,
listen to.
yeah,
And typically that inner circle agrees with everything that leader
of course.
their
Yeah,
perspective. They surround themselves with people who will agree with them.
that's
And
right.
those people who are, the different thinkers who could take that team to the next level because they're not in the common thinking, they are not seen and they are not heard. So it's really up to the leader to acknowledge. And sometimes they don't do it intentionally, have an inner circle. But sometimes if you point it out to them, they realize that they unintentionally do,
Mhm.
and to encourage them to kind of expand into getting more input and getting different ideas on the table and listening to them and not, as you said, automatically rejecting them because they are different. And then the next phase is, yeah, a decision's a decision, but then you do need implementation for that decision to be successful. So then who
Right.
needs to be part of that decision making, and that's the buy-in, to buy
Right.
into it so that there will
It
be
reminds me,
successful
it reminds me of a
implementation.
department manager I used to have a long time ago, and he was a former military person, and he told me the story about how he was working, I think it was with a colonel or a general at the time, and they basically said, "Look, we want you to go from," he was pointing to a map and said, "I want you to move from this point to this point, make it happen." And then he's kind of thinking about it. And so he talks to his people afterwards. It's like, does he not realize there's a giant mountain range in the middle of
Yeah.
that line that he drew? And so that same idea to me is that
Yeah.
perspective is that we make decisions sometimes without understanding but
Yeah.
there's significant challenges that we have to overcome to execute. So it's definitely something that I've always come back to because there's a lot of decisions that affect us in the real world, but sometimes they're being made by folks with limited information or insight, or they just don't seem to care about that
And
impact.
who aren't seeking the additional information because
Correct.
the need for speed, they just want to make things go fast without taking
Right.
the time to really understand
And to reframe
what,
that, maybe there's a nuance from a cultural issue there as well, where people aren't
yes,
they're not comfortable bringing up, hey, that doesn't make any sense, kind of contrary to what I said.
correct.
But hey, there's challenges to this decision. We're happy to do it, but here's the implications of what's going to happen and why we won't meet speed, why it won't be speedy or expeditious for us to go off and do it this way, et cetera. They don't always look at the advantages and disadvantages. So interesting.
And then the last thing I just have to add, because I can't believe it still happens today, is women have a challenge with this. I work with a lot of female leaders, and this is a story that's been around for at least 30 years. When I bring up an idea around the table, no reaction to it, and a man will bring up the same idea moments later, and they'll go, "That's fantastic."
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Still happens till this day. So,
Jenny, years ago, and you could probably go find this on the internet, Brian, you'll appreciate this too. There was a FedEx commercial, and it was in a boardroom, and there was this young guy that had this great idea, and he was talking about how we expand, the geography and things like that. And everybody was dead silent. And then the president said, "You know what we need to do is we need to expand geographically." And everybody goes, "Yeah, that's a great idea." And the guy's going, "Well, he just said what I said." And they go, "No, no, you went like this." And you went like this. And that shutting down
yeah,
is so destructive
yeah,
because it does erode trust. You're absolutely right. And what it does is
yeah,
it takes away motivation, and people just say,
yes. They
"What's
check
the
out.
it's the
Yep,
what's the point?" sort of
yeah,
feeling.
yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
I just want to build on what Jenny said too, because, we've had such high success rates in our innovation projects because we've intentionally gotten people who are not directly related in the early stages of the idea
Mm,
to be part of it. So then when it comes time to approve it, they saw the process, they understand
yes.
what was going on, and they're more likely, to approve it. Sometimes you can't do that. My business partner was requesting $10 million dollars from the board of Unilever. He couldn't get the board to be involved. But what he did was 30 days before the decision had to be made about whether they were going to, allot this $10 million dollars or not, he went to every board member and said, "This is the idea. What do you think? Any challenges you have?" And so he spent that whole month answering and addressing their concerns. So when it came time for the decision, it was almost already made because he had
Yeah.
addressed their challenges. So,
Mm.
Well, it's why
Um,
I've always said to people in the consulting profession, the business doctoring profession, if you will, your job is not to be the smartest person in the room. Your job is to get things accomplished, and so that means pre-presents. I've had a rule in my business that when you have an important change, you don't go into a big meeting and announce it and share it with everybody. You go to
right.
every individual person you
Yep.
pre-present, and if you
Yeah.
don't do that, I mean, in my world, that's literally a terminable offense if you don't do that, because
Yeah.
your job is to make sure that people buy in, and it's the same thing when you go out to the factory floor. You talk to the people and get their ideas.
That's right.
Back. The other comment I want to make that kind of ties all this together, and Jenny, always interested in your perspective of this. It seems like as people become more senior in their roles, particularly in the C-suite, that there's almost something genetically that causes them to stop being curious. And
Mm.
and I guess it ties back to what Brian talked about, and I sent Brian a slide a little bit ago that said that curiosity in my world, I've always viewed curiosity as wondering why things work the way they do. It's like being a 2-year-old again.
Mm.
And that leads to imagination. You can't imagine different ways of doing things unless you're curious as to why they work that way in the first place. And then of course, creativity is really engineering the best solution, actually, that manifests from those curiosities and imagination. Well, if you shut down curiosity, don't you just shut down the whole process?
Yeah. Yes.
I
Absolutely.
I I, I mean, every time somebody says to me, "Well, that we've never done it that way before.
Yeah.
To me, what they're describing, interestingly enough, is an institution. And that, in other words, they've got a way, a process, a product, a method that's institutionalized. And what they view it is that I'm trying to change the institution, where
Yeah.
I'm just questioning. I'm just curious and imaginative, and I'm not trying to send their process to the moon. I'm just asking why.
Right.
I always wonder these people. I mean, what kind of parents must they be?
Well, you
But,
know,
It's this very transactional way
I
of
mean, I
leading,
mean,
you know?
look at Tim. I mean, Tim shared with us this whole story. This wonderful, wonderful story, and congratulations on this one about putting different hair on dinosaurs with his kids. I mean, that is the way executives should behave. Change the context, but don't change the logic.
That's right.
but
That's
and
right.
I just have to build on that because my daughter and I don't know how old she was. We were watching Wizard of Oz, and Glinda was there, and she goes off, right? And she goes off into this yellow orb, right? She goes into this and goes away. And my daughter said to me, "Where's she going?" Now I could have said, well, she's going to blah 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 blah. But happily, luckily as a parent, I didn't have an answer for her. I said, well, where do you think she's going? And then I was floored. She said, oh, I think she's going to play tennis. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, because it looks like a yellow tennis ball. I mean, if I had an answer, I never would have heard that. So sometimes we want to answer a question with a quote, answer a question with a question.
100%.
Right,
Yeah, you got to
right.
build on the creativity and give them the space to continue to think down their own path. And that to me is, it's all about is even, with my daughter as well, it's, she'll do a presentation or she'll do a show or do something like outside and I'll ask her, she's like, oh, how did I do, Dad? And I said, well, let me ask you, how do you think you did? Right. And you start with that perspective and kind of helping them build their own perspective of things before I offer mine. And the same idea with ideation is that you, instead of offering your perspective first and your ideas first, or your answer, you give them an opportunity to kind of shape it and you can build off it from there as well. Um, Alan, there's a couple questions in the chat for you, so at least maybe we can do one of these live here.
Sure.
The first one, don't China's manufacturing cities focused on proximity in the ecosystem? And then there's the second one there if you want to take a shot at it.
Well, I haven't seen the second one here, but yeah, the answer to that question is absolutely yes. So China has done what Henry Ford did. Henry Ford has to be almost deity in China in some ways, because in a sense they grew, but to grow a middle class, they grew middle class by building manufacturing industry, and they did it so well, and they literally followed the strategy of Henry Ford and Albert Sloan and a few others as well. And so yes, they really tried to reduce the cycle time. Now, the problem they ran into was as technology advanced, all specialization did not exist in China.
Mhm.
And so they had to do the same thing. And so to a large extent, a lot of Chinese companies, all the manufacturing is not done in China. Some of the engineering is done another part of the world. Maybe the basic manufacturing of ingredients or componentry is done in China, and all final subassembly might be done even in a different province of China. So yes, that's China has really emphasized vertical integration in their whole manufacturing sector. I've been there, I've seen it. I've been to iPhone City. I mean, you won't see a factory in the United States with over 500,000 employees. At one time, surged up to 1 million employees in one factory. I mean, that's an enormous number of people, and almost the curvature of the Earth almost causes you not to be able to see one end of the factory from the other. And so, that strategy has worked uh, well, but now time is their enemy. So the time to market, time to design new products, perhaps will work against them on that strategy. So yes,
I,
again,
Alan,
change the context, but not the logic.
when you mentioned this, because I hadn't even heard about it, I feel, uninformed, but I thought the whole time you were going to be talking about national security for us,
No,
and you didn't even mention that.
it's
So do you
another,
want to
it's a
say
whole other
something
topic.
about that?
Yeah, so we wrote a paper on what we call sovereign supply chains. It's been making its rounds through Washington, D.C. and a number of trade. We've briefed a number of folks in the State Department as well, the Department of Commerce on this. And the idea is, it's very simply is that kind of globalization, and particularly with China, I don't really care who makes my bread or my Pringles, but I do care about who makes the the circuit boards for the triggers for nuclear missiles. And yes, we have actually had components at that level, that security level, that have been made offshore. And so I have a little bit of a problem with that. There's some products that we need in the U.S. or some products that any country needs that nobody should be making them outside of their borders. I mean, and so the idea is that we need to identify those, and that needs to be part of the trade policy. Boy, we learn a lesson with N95 masks during the pandemic, and that was hardly a national security issue. That was mostly just the Chinese being better free market capitalists than we were. I mean, when you think about it, and this is what happens when you have an industry that sets its sight on domination, not on competition. I remember many, many, many years ago when the big fully integrated open hearth steel mills were having competition by these electric mini mills. But an electric mini mill had an 8 to 10 year payback if you built it, and U.S. Steel decided not to do that. Instead, they decided to invest in insurance companies. Like that has anything to do with steel. And when asked why, they said, well, because the payback period is faster. And then they asked the CEO of Mitsui why they were doing this in Japan, why they were doing mini mills. And he said, what should the payback period be when annihilation of your industry or domination of your industry is what's at stake? You have to take a different perspective of this. That's one of the reasons why. Silicon Valley is invented. Silicon Valley exists because there were young people that didn't know what they didn't know. And they created companies like Apple, and they created companies like Teradata, and they created companies, that made, some of the early PCs and Altair computers and stuff like that. I always ask the question, why did IBM not invent Apple? Why did Blockbuster Video not create Netflix? I mean, and part of this goes back to what Jenny talked about. It's that kind of refusing to discuss and even consider anything other than the status quo. Edward Deming said, and I was in a meeting with Edward Deming at Caltech in 1984. Nick Nichols, who ran the CTME at that time, had Edward Deming, and I got to sit at a lunch table with about 6 people. And Edward Deming we're talking about this, and he said, look, my solution is basically forced retirement on all technology company executives at 45 years of age. Because at 45, they become careerists, not innovators. And he said, and so their job is to shut down things, not great ideas, just things that challenge the status quo. In other words, they become risk adverse. Look, as we all get older, I don't take the risks today that I used to take when I was, in my 30s. I mean, nobody does. And so it's an understandable phenomena. But I think that when we take a look at this, we realize very quickly on a global basis that other companies grow. China grew because they took a domination strategy in the certainly in electronics, and also, by the way, in nutritional supplements. Most people don't realize 90% of all ingredients of all nutritional supplements sold in the United States come from China. Over 90%. Wow. FDA's biggest field office is in China. So,
wow. Well, I wanted to wrap things up here, friends. Thanks for the conversation. Thanks for the round. So thanks for the questions from the listeners and from the audience. But that's a wrap here on this spring edition of Curious and Quirky. Today was a reminder that the future might look ridiculous. It might sound made up. It might scale faster than you might be ready for, or it might depend on decisions that we're not quite sure how to make just yet. A big Easter-sized basket, thanks to all our speakers for bringing fresh ideas and bold perspectives. So take what you heard, challenge it, test it, and maybe see what grows. Stay curious, stay quirky, and if your next idea sounds a little ridiculous, good. That's usually how it starts. I mean, I once asked what dinosaurs would look like with hair, and honestly, I think we're still onto something. Until next time, have a great weekend, everybody.